Well, we've only got two more teachings on the Faith's Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to look at Moses this evening, and then next evening we're going to have a look at the sort of conclusion that briefly mentions different people and then finally applies it in a conclusion to our lives. A reminder that the book of Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians that are under tremendous pressure to go back to the old ways before they followed Christ, back to the old covenant, back to the law, back to the things that they had been brought up in, rather than to go forward with the new covenant. And what the author is intending to do in Hebrews 11 is remind them, or not remind them, but teach them that living by faith was always the way that God's people lived. And that even in the Old Testament, right from the beginning, those that were closest to God and those that were approved by God, it was by faith that they were approved. The idea being that using characters well known to these Jewish Christians from the Old Testament, they would be able to see that their walking by faith and living by faith is echoed by those that came before them. And so the different characters we've looked at in Hebrews 11 and the little sort of summaries that the author has given about them, he pulls out things in their lives that he wants to really apply to the Hebrews' present day situation. Last week, we looked at the faith of Moses's parents, and this week we're going to have a look at the faith of Moses. So let me share a scripture with you. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 to 28. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So we come to Moses himself, and as we've been studying the different characters in Faith's Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11, I hope you've been seeing sort of repeated themes. I've certainly, as I've been doing this, noticed repeated themes throughout these different characters that we should highlight and apply to our lives. There is a sense of a journey where they're following God. That there's a path for them that God has set for their lives, and that as they follow this path, it has to be by faith. It's got to be by trusting God. They're pilgrims on the earth. There's a strong motif of being a pilgrim, these men and these women. In other words, you'll see again and again that they don't make themselves at home on the earth. That they don't make themselves comfortable. They leave their homes. They leave their comfort. They're on a movement with God. They don't just stay where they are. They get up and they follow God. And also, all of them, their destination is not in this earth or found in this earth. This isn't their goal. You have a picture of them all traveling towards something that is invisible, something that is in the future, something that is heavenly. A heavenly city is mentioned a number of times. Abraham never made a city on earth because he didn't want to, he didn't see himself as a permanent resident on earth. So there's this idea that they're journeying through this earth as pilgrims, but they are looking for their real home that will be there in the future, which will be the heavenly Jerusalem. There's also a note of them turning their back on the world and everything that the world has to offer. There's also a note of them separating themselves from those that didn't believe. They separate themselves. They reject, when you look at these people, they reject the system of the world, the values of the world, the rewards that the world promises. And it's almost like they refuse to act as if what the world has is all that there is. And you see that again and again in these different characters being highlighted. So when we look at Moses, we find by faith when he was grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So we get this theme again. He refuses, as many of them do, all of them do, to identify himself with the natural course of events. Abraham refused to stay in his home, but moved forward. Noah refused to identify with the fallen world, but built an ark. This sense of refusing to identify with the worldliness that is around them and rejecting it, even if it means a cost or a price to pay. So Moses, as you know in the story, he was brought up by the Pharaoh's daughter, and that was a miracle in itself, how she took him in, as we looked last week. But he would have been educated in the things of Egypt. He would be educated very strongly, a prince of Egypt. That's what he was. And as he was doing this, he would be Egyptian in culture, Egyptian in language, Egyptian in friendships and society. He was an Egyptian prince as this princess's son. So he'd be all these things, everything that you would want in that earthly speaking, everything, that privilege, power, education, all of these things. But he refuses to say, this is who I am. Instead, he identifies with the last people you would identify with if you were a royal, rich, educated person. He identifies with the people of God who were slaves, who were building all the time. A terrible situation to be an Israelite at that time, a Jew at that time. Terrible, but wonderful to be an Egyptian in the royal house at that time. So this is faith. By faith, it says he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing to be mistreated with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin. You see this theme again in Hebrews 11. It's rejecting what the world has to offer in favor of believing God and walking in faith according to God's promises and principles at a cost. And remember, those that were reading this letter for the first time, these Jewish Christians who were being highly persecuted, the easiest thing in the world for them, would be to return to their old covenant Judaism and go back to the old ways. They'd immediately be accepted back in their families who'd rejected them. They'd be welcomed back in their synagogues that had kicked them out. They would be welcomed back in the marketplace where they'd been excluded by Jewish people. Easiest thing in the world would be to go back to their former identity as non-believing Jews. So here to see Moses choosing to identify with the people of God and God's calling, rather than the ease of the world is very powerful to them. And it's a choosing to be mistreated with the people of God rather to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. There were pleasures abounding for Moses where he was. He didn't have to lift a finger. He didn't need to do anything for these fellow Jews, which he had very little to do with, very little links with them. But he could have just enjoyed the pleasures of power, the pleasures of Egypt were many, many, many. I mean, you couldn't compare the pleasures that were available for a prince of Egypt, especially when you compare them with the miseries and mistreatment of the people of God. What a huge thing. You know, throughout history, there's always been those that when they're pressured decide that following Christ or following God isn't worth it. The cares of this world choke the word in their lives. The easy way, and the broad path, which is easy, is taken instead of the narrow path that is focused. So this is a beautiful picture of Moses, one of the most important patriarchs, turning his back on instant gratification or present gratification for future glory. And all of these people in Hebrews 11 did this. They turned their back on the present offer of indulgence and self-gratification, saying, no, there's something far better in the future. And that's what I want. I want what's coming in the future. And if that means that I have to deny myself the ease or the pleasures or the comfort of this life, that's fine, because the prize in the future is better. And so in verse 26, let me just show you it again. Verse 26, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. Just let that sink in. The treasures of Egypt were huge, huge. I mean, all these treasure hunters in the last 100, 200 years finding these incredible treasures in pyramids and everything, and that's just the treasures that were left by the pyramid robbers. The reproach of Christ, greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. What an incredible thing. You could meditate on that. He, like the rest that we've seen, have got their eyes on something that's heavenly, something that at the time is invisible and spiritual, a reward, a wealth. So it was sort of like, it wasn't just that he walked with God and was prepared to suffer for God. Part of his motivation, a strong part here, says he's looking for a reward. He wants something better. You know, sometimes I think when I hear Christians say, I'm not looking for a reward, I'm just following Jesus out of love, I just think, how pathetic. You more holy than Jesus, who for the joy and reward set before him endured the cross. So Christians that don't think about a reward, or don't think about that which is in the future, they're super spiritual, and I don't believe them. But those that are human and know that God works in reward systems. Of course, salvation is not a reward, it's a gift. But God rewards who? Find it in Hebrews, don't you? You have to believe that God is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek. It doesn't say you just have to believe. It says you could believe that God is, and he is a rewarder. Sooner or later in this life, and more fully in the future life, he will reward faith. Faith will be rewarded sometimes in this life because God encourages us, but it will be fully rewarded when Jesus returns and when we reach our home in the New Jerusalem. So he's looking for the reward. He's like counting all the treasures that are available for him in Egypt, and he's saying, do you know what? Everything the world, Egypt, has to offer me that I've had is nothing compared to the wealth of Christ. And what Christ has got for me and what Christ has got in store for me is so amazing that all the things of this earth that are nothing in comparison. And that's what I want to get. I want to get the reward. I want to this is what I'm doing. And so, I mean, did he know about Jesus? Well, he had a prophetic understanding of the movement of God throughout the Jewish people. So he understood that God was moving forward and that God's plans and God's redemption was to do with the Jewish people. And then it says, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, a bit like his parents were not afraid of the king. Won't go into detail there, but there again is a theme throughout Hebrews 11. These men and women, they weren't intimidated by the powers of this world and authorities of this world. They were not intimidated by the powers and the authorities of this world. His parents weren't. He wasn't afraid of the anger of the king because he saw him who was invisible. He knew that God was involved in his life because God had showed him, that God had a purpose, that God was real, that God rewards, and that God was greater than Pharaoh. And so seeing him who was invisible, he had too much fear and respect of the Lord to have too much fear and respect of the world's rulers. And then finally, let me just share this again. Finally, 28, by faith he kept the Passover, sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So that night, this is talking about the first Passover. This is talking about, when God's told him to tell the Jewish people to take a lamb and to put the blood on the doorposts of their homes because the destroyer was coming to kill every firstborn creature in Egypt. And so you had to believe to do this. You had to believe and act to do this. Remember, we're used to Passover. We're used to Passover. We're used to communion. We're used to all these things. Put yourself in Moses's position when nobody had ever done this before. I know they understood sacrifice, but the idea of Passover, the idea of blood on a door, all these Passover things, it was brand new. So this was by faith. There was no pattern before him. When we take communion or talk about Passover and Easter that we've just had, Holy Week, we have a pattern. We have a pattern. We can read about it. We're taught about it as Christians. If we're children, the Jews have passed this story down, generation to generation. And so everybody knows about Passover. Imagine when there was no such thing as Passover, no such thing as this. It was the first time. But this Passover was going to set in motion the deliverance of the people of Israel from Egypt. And not only that, it was going to be the model of the Lamb that John the Baptist said, the Lamb, behold, the Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world. If there'd been no Passover, how could anybody have understood what John was saying? So by faith he kept the Passover, sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. And that blood, and we won't go into all the stuff we could preach about the blood setting them free, the blood protecting them, the blood releasing them from slavery. We could do all of those things. But the sprinkling of this was for the first time. And so by doing this, he was taking God's plan forward. And so that's Moses. And as I said, we have recorded every single person. I've done a teaching on every single person in the book of Hebrews 11. So if you've missed any, you can always go back and look at them. And it's not just what he says about the individuals. I hope those of you that have been regular, I hope you can see the patterns that come again and again and again. that I mentioned right at the beginning of this teaching, because those are the patterns that we have to follow in our lives today, just as the Jewish Christians under great pressure were encouraged to do in that day. Next week will be the final session on Hebrews 11, Faith Hall of Fame, where we'll be seeing how there was just so many people that the author could mention, and that in other words, you can pick your own man or woman of God from the Old Testament, and you could do the same as me, he's almost saying. And then he finally brings the main point that he's been taking right through Hebrews 11 to conclusion. Thank you, Pastor Peter.